Noor didn't cry when her mother placed the silver anklet in the merchant's hands. She had cried the night before, alone, under the neem tree near the dried-up well, where the wind couldn't hear and the dirt could hold secrets. But now, in the morning sun, with her wrists bound in red cloth and her father staring at the horizon, she was silent. She can't bear children, the merchant had been told. Her womb is cursed, but she can cook, and she's obedient. That was her price, not in coins, but in failure. A price calculated by the number of miscarriages, the hours her ex-husband beat her, and the weight of disappointment she carried like a second skin. Noor was 19, and sold. The man who bought her wasn't like the others. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask about her past. He simply handed over the coins and nodded. His name was Caleb, a rough, quiet lumberjack from the edge of the eastern forests. Had 4 children, and no wife. They said she had died in a fire 2 winters ago. Some said Caleb started it himself. Others whispered that grief made him mad. He lived alone now, miles from the nearest path, in a wooden cabin where trees grew like ghosts and fog never lifted. That's where Noor was taken. Not as a bride, not as a servant, but something in between. The first night, she slept on a mat near the stove. The children stared at her like she was a shadow wearing skin. The youngest, Ezra, cried when she touched his shoulder. Grace, the oldest girl, refused to eat the lentils Noor cooked. The twin boys called her the witch from the wasteland. Caleb said nothing. He only chopped wood, fed the dogs, smoked his pipe under the cracked porch and watched the rain. But on the 3rd night, when Noor slipped on the wet floor and scraped her palm, it was he who brought the salve. Gently, silently, as if apologizing for a storm he couldn't control. That was the first time Noor realized something broken in him, recognized something broken in her. Weeks passed. She learned the names of the birds that sang before dawn. She learned that Ezra only slept if someone hummed a song with no words. She learned that Caleb sometimes cried, never aloud. But his shoulders shook when he thought no one was watching. And then came the night she bled again, the same way she had bled in her first marriage. The same cruel reminder that her body was an empty field no seed could stay in. She sat outside, knees to her chest, tears burning, and Caleb found her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer false comfort. He simply sat beside her and said, "The trees lose leaves, every year, and still they stand." Noor didn't know if he meant it for her, but that was the first night she fell asleep beside someone without feeling like a burden. And for the first time in years, she dreamed of something other than escape. The monsoon came early that year. The forest, which had been brittle and dry, turned soft under the weight of rain. The roof of the cabin leaked in 3 places. Noor patched it with old cloth and prayer. The children had begun to change. Ezra no longer flinched when Noor touched his hair. Grace started leaving small things in the kitchen for her, a carved spoon, a folded napkin, once even a flower. The twins had stopped calling her names. Now they simply called her Noor. She cooked for them, washed their clothes, told stories with quiet voices and wide eyes. She stitched their worn socks and rubbed their backs when fevers came. There was no ceremony, no titles, just presence. Constant, gentle presence. Caleb remained a silence within the silence. He still left before dawn to cut wood and returned after sunset with his axe slung over his shoulder and sawdust in his beard. He rarely spoke unless necessary. But when he did, his words carried weight, like a tree bending toward the earth with fruit. One night, a storm knocked out the oil lamp. Ezra panicked. He had never learned to sit in the dark without shaking. Noor lit a match, but it broke. The second match flickered and died, and then Caleb's voice came, steady and soft. "Ezra," he said, "close your eyes, count to 10 with me." They did. Ezra's breathing slowed. The storm passed. Noor watched Caleb from across the room and realized that stillness could be louder than words. That night, she stayed up long after the others slept, mending Grace's torn shawl by lantern light. Caleb walked past her once. He paused, looked down, and said, "You don't have to keep fixing what's already ruined." Noor didn't look up. She simply replied, "Some things are ruined because no one ever tried." The next day, he left a new spool of thread on her windowsill. Weeks turned into months. The villagers spoke in hushed tones when they saw Caleb in the market with Noor walking behind him. A few spat near their feet. One woman muttered, "First his wife burned, now he brings the barren girl." Noor heard it. So did Caleb. He said nothing. But that night, when she brought his tea, he looked at her, really looked, and asked, "Do you ever miss where you came from?" Noor hesitated, then said, "I only miss the things I never had." She didn't tell him that sometimes in her sleep, she still heard her mother's voice saying, "What good is a woman who brings no sons?" She didn't tell him that even now, she counted the days of the month not to track time, but to brace for shame. Caleb didn't ask. But the next morning, there was a new blanket at her bedside. Not bought, not bartered, hand-stitched, uneven, but warm. It smelled of cedar and smoke and rain. By spring, Noor had learned how to sharpen an axe. She carried water without spilling. She taught Ezra how to tie knots and helped Grace press flowers between the pages of her mother's old Bible. There were no vows, no rings, no names whispered in passion. But one evening, while they all sat around the fire and Noor hummed that wordless song, Caleb fell asleep on the floor, his hand just inches from hers. It stayed there all night. In the morning, he didn't pull it away, and neither did she. But peace is a fragile thing in places where people believe love must follow rules. The kind of love that grows in silence, that wraps around the wounded and builds itself without permission. That kind of love threatens those who fear it. It was Grace who heard the whisper first. At the water well, two women talking. They say, she cursed the lumberjack's house. That's why his wife died. That's why she was sold. A woman like that, she doesn't belong among children. Grace came home in tears. Noor washed her face and held her, saying nothing. But that night, when Caleb stepped outside and found Noor burning her wedding clothes, the ones from her first marriage, he didn't stop her. He only asked, "What will you wear now?" Noor stared into the fire and said, "Whatever is, given without fear." The flames rose, smoke climbed the trees, and somewhere deep in the forest, something long dead stirred. A stranger came to the cabin in the dusk, his boots caked in red mud and his voice heavy with familiarity. Noor wished she'd forgotten. He had a scar beneath his left eye and a knife tucked too casually into his belt. Caleb stepped onto the porch, first shielding the doorway with his body before the man even spoke. "I'm here for the woman," he said. Noor froze inside. She knew that voice, Rafiq, her ex-husband, the man who had once promised her figs in summer, children in winter, and fists in every season in between. "I paid for her," Rafiq said, staring straight at Caleb. "She was mine," and she ran, Noor. Stepped forward, her hand trembling on the doorframe. "I didn't run," she said. "They sold me. You made sure they had a reason." "She's barren," Rafiq said. "You'll see. She's good for nothing." Caleb didn't blink. "She's good for more than you'll ever be." Rafiq stepped closer. "You think you can keep what doesn't belong to you? The law here is tribal. Her blood is my right." But he had misjudged the man standing between them. Caleb didn't argue. He moved, a single step, an arm across Rafiq's chest, a warning not spoken but carved into his breath. The forest behind them rustled, as if the trees themselves listened. Rafik left with spit on his boots and rage in his eyes. "But not before," he whispered. "I'll return." Noor didn't sleep that night. Neither did Caleb. He sat by the fire sharpening his axe while she boiled water, her hands shaking too hard to hold the pot steady. "I don't want to be a war," she whispered. Caleb didn't look up. "You're not. You're what's left after the war is done." But war always finds the ones who try to live quietly. The next week, someone set fire to the woodpile behind the cabin. Ezra screamed when he saw the flames. Grace ran for the buckets. Caleb beat the fire down with his jacket until his hands blistered. Noor stood motionless, a wet cloth in her hands, watching the ash rise. Later, she found something half buried in the dirt behind the cabin. A small ring. Her old ring. The one Rafik had taken from her when he divorced her, violently, loudly, without prayer. She buried it under the steps. That night, when the children were asleep and the lamps were out, Noor walked into the forest with a single match, a bundle of cloth, and Caleb's old pipe. She had made a decision. She returned before sunrise, her hair soaked from the morning dew, her fingertips blackened with smoke. Caleb watched her come in. She didn't speak. But she handed him something, his wife's ring, the one that had survived the fire. He stared at it for a long time. Then at her. "It's time," she said, voice steady. He nodded. They didn't need a priest or an elder. They didn't need witnesses or words carved in stone. He took her hand. She didn't let go. That was the night Noor stopped being the woman someone bought. She became the one someone chose. And yet, just as joy began to breathe in the walls of their home, a letter arrived, folded in goatskin and sealed in dust tea. Bore the mark of the tribal court. Noor was summoned, not for what she had done, but for who she had become. A woman once sold, now loved, and they would not allow it to go unanswered. Caleb read the letter twice. Then, once again, he didn't say anything. Just walked out into the forest. When he returned, he was carrying the axe, but this time, it wasn't for trees. Noor looked at him and asked the question they had both been avoiding. "What will they do to me?" he answered honestly. "Whatever. Makes them feel powerful again." And she said nothing more, because she knew. It was never about justice. It was about silencing the ones who dared to live after they had been buried alive. The tribal court sat beneath an ancient fig tree, its branches long and crooked like fingers ready to point blame. Stones marked the place where justice was supposed to live, but in Noor's eyes, they looked more like graves, each one waiting, to be named after another woman who dared to survive. She stood barefoot, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, while the elders sat in a half-circle like wolves waiting for weakness. Caleb stood behind her, a silent wall of fire and smoke, his presence alone enough to draw whispers from the crowd that had come to watch. Noor recognized no kindness in the faces before her. Only curiosity, the kind that leans in to see if the accused will cry or crumble. The eldest judge, Qazi Abdul, cleared his throat, a sound dry as rust. "You were bought as a maid, not a wife," he said. "Yet now you wear this man's ring. Do you understand how shameful that is?" Noor didn't flinch. "I was sold as silence. But silence doesn't mean consent." A ripple moved through the crowd. A few women dropped their eyes. Men crossed their arms. Caleb's jaw clenched. "She's not one of us." Another elder said, "She's barren, tainted. No son, no witness. She has nothing to offer." It was Ezra who shouted from the back. "She gave me back my voice." The child pushed through the legs and robes, tears streaking his cheeks. "She held me when I cried. She taught me how to count again. She sat beside me when the fire came. The judge raised a hand to silence him, but Caleb stepped forward. If you call what we have shame, then perhaps it's your laws that are barren. Gasps, accusation. And then Grace stepped into the circle, trembling but tall. She's my mother, she said. She never gave birth to me, but she became my mother the first day she sang that song with no words. She stayed when no one else did. 2 more voices joined. The twins. She taught us to read, one said. She taught us how to stay, the other added. It was too much. The court was shaken, not because they believed Noor had done no wrong, but because they could no longer pretend the children were blind. Children didn't lie, not about love. The decision came slowly, like smoke creeping through a locked door. She will not be punished, Qazi Abdul said at last. But she will never be recognized. No title, no land, no name beside his. If she dies forgotten. Noor looked at Caleb. He looked back and said, "Then I will be forgotten with her." That night, they walked home under a sky too big to belong to any law. The children clung to Noor's hands, and Caleb walked beside her, his arm finally, around her shoulders. They didn't speak. What could be said? They had lost their names, but they had kept each other. For a time, that was enough. Until winter came early, and with it, a knock at the door. It was a traveler from across the border. He didn't speak much, but his presence was urgent. He carried a small leather bag and a message meant only for Caleb. They stepped outside. When Caleb returned, his face was different, set in stone, older somehow, as if time had skipped forward, while he was gone. "I have to leave," he said. Noor's breath caught. "Why?" He looked at her for a long time, then knelt before Ezra and the others. "There are people looking for me. Things I did in the war, things I thought were buried." Noor felt the earth tilt beneath her. "So you'll run?" "I'll disappear, but not as a man escaping punishment, as a father protecting his children." The words were knives, softly, spoken. Noor touched his face with both hands. "I was never afraid of being alone," she whispered. "Only of being left without goodbye." He kissed her forehead, and at dawn, he was gone. He left behind a wooden box filled with seeds and a note carved into the inside of the lid. "For every tree I've cut, let this be the one that grows." Noor planted the seeds behind the cabin. She watered them with silence and waited. Years passed. The children grew. People forgot. But one day, when Grace stood under the first tree that bore fruit, she whispered to her siblings, "I think he loved us most in the way he left." And Noor, from the doorway, watched the leaves move with the wind. Not gone, just hidden, like love in places where no one bothers to look. Winters came and went like cautious guests. The forest grew thicker, its silence deeper. Noor spent her mornings tending the soil Caleb had left behind, and her nights sewing warmth into every thread the children wore. Grace took up drawing with coal on wood. Faces she remembered, scenes from stories Noor told. Ezra, older now, began carving small animals out of driftwood and setting them on the windowsill, waiting for one of them to fly. The twins had grown tall and strong. They chopped wood like their father once had, and built a second room behind the cabin so Grace could have her own space. Noor didn't ask them to. She didn't need to. Their love had deep roots. But even peace, when it stays too long, invites the past to visit. One cold morning, just before dawn, Grace opened the door and found a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside it, an envelope, a bone-handled knife, and a strip of cloth stained with dried blood. No note, no name. Noor stared at it for a long time, her fingers barely grazing the cloth. Her eyes dimmed, not with fear, but with memory. She knew that fabric, It had belonged to Caleb. The way it was torn, frayed at one edge. She remembered mending it once, back when their lives still hung by thread and firelight. She didn't speak for hours. By sunset, she stood before the fire, the envelope in her hands. Inside was a single line, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. He didn't die fighting, he was taken. Ezra read it aloud. Silence swallowed the cabin. The next morning, Noor left the children in Grace's care. She wore a dark shawl, packed dried bread, water, and the knife. She told no one where she was going. But before she stepped into the trees, she pressed Ezra's hand to her heart. "If I don't return," she said, "grow something where I fell." Then she walked into the forest. She followed the river upstream, where the land turned cruel and the birds no longer sang. She crossed paths with old shepherds, mountain women with eyes like smoke, and hunters who offered no smiles, only warnings. Turn back. But Noor didn't. Each night she camped under the stars, speaking nothing but Caleb's name into the sky. Sometimes she thought she heard the forest answer, groaning in pain, like something sacred had been broken and buried. On the 5th day, she reached the foothills where the war had once burned hottest. There, in the shadow of blackened trees, she met an old soldier. He didn't ask for her name, only looked at the knife in her hand and said, "You're his." She didn't nod. She didn't have to. The soldier limped toward a cave hollowed into the rock. He wouldn't talk, he said. Even when they broke his ribs, even when they threatened his children. He kept saying one thing. "What?" Noor's voice cracked. "They already survived me. What else can you take?" She stepped into the cave. There was no body, only a carving on the wall. It wasn't a name. It was a tree, etched with 4 branches, and beside it, the shape of a woman holding them all. She fell to her knees. Grief did not howl. It whispered. He had died as he lived, quietly, fully, without permission. Noor lit a small fire inside the cave and placed the cloth beside it. Then she whispered the word she had never said to him. Mine. On her way back, the river rose. Her feet slipped. She bled. Her voice cracked from crying too long and too quietly, but she carried the memory like a flame. When she reached the cabin weeks later, her hair tangled, her hands scarred, Ezra ran to her and shouted, "We planted the seeds." Grace came after him, holding a sapling in her arms. "It's growing," she said. "The tree. The one from his carving." Noor sank to her knees and buried her face in the dirt where the roots touched earth. And finally, she wept. Because something had returned. Not a man, not a name, but proof. That love, when planted deeply enough, could outlive even silence. The tree grew taller than the roof of the cabin by the second spring. Its branches reached skyward like prayers that refused to be silenced. And Noor began each morning by sitting beneath it, whispering memories into its roots. The children, no longer quite children, took turns building a wooden fence around it, as if protecting something sacred. It was the only grave Caleb would ever have. And somehow, it was enough. But peace is never a permanent guest, not in lands where old debts fester in soil and men with power can't bear to see a woman build anything from ruin. A messenger came, in the night. He didn't knock, only left a scroll tied to the fence. It carried a demand, not a warning. The tribal council had declared that Noor's children, for that was what they were now, no matter their blood, must be separated and reassigned to their nearest male kin. Her guardianship was null. She had no husband, no land deed, no tribal name. Her adoption had no ink, only love. And love meant nothing to the ones who worshipped paper and blood. The message was final. On the next full moon they would come. Grace cried first. The twins argued. Ezra asked the one question Noor could not answer. Do they think we don't belong to you? She kissed his forehead. They know you do, she said. That's why they're afraid. For the first time, Noor considered fleeing. Crossing. The border. Disappearing into the far valleys where law turned into legend. But she knew such life would not be life at all. Running would teach the children that silence was safety. And she had not survived her own burial just to teach them how to hide. So she stayed and wrote. The ink was made from burnt leaves and ash. The paper was torn from old books, faded with sun and time. Each child wrote their truth, 1 page each. No names, no dates, just truth. Noor gathered the pages and walked to the village court before dawn. She placed them on the elder's doorstep and walked away without looking back. By dusk, everyone had read them. One spoke of hunger, not of food, but for kindness. One spoke of a dream where they didn't flinch when a man raised his hand. One spoke of a woman who smelled like firewood and sang like a wound that never healed. One simply said, "She chose us when no one else would." The elders summoned her, but she did not go. This time, the village came to her. Not all, but many. Women, mostly. Some men. Even one of the old judges, limping up the hill, eyes no longer proud but weary. He looked at the children, then at Noor. "They will take your name," he said quietly. "Not the one you were born with, the one you built." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded and turned toward the tree. She began carving something into its trunk, slowly, as if every letter bled. It wasn't Caleb's name. It wasn't hers. It was one word: survivors. Seasons turned. The cabin became 2. The children married, stayed, built gardens, not fences. Grace became a midwife, Ezra, a teacher. The twins opened a school under the tree where no child was hit, and every child learned how to listen and how to speak. Noor's hair turned white, her steps slower. But her voice, once hidden beneath layers of dust and duty, became something the village leaned toward, not away from. One day, a girl came to her, barefoot and afraid. "They want to sell me," she said, "because I can't give sons." Noor poured her water. "Let her sit." Then she said, "They said the same of me." She pointed to the tree. "Plant your life where they buried your name. That's how we begin." The girl stayed. Another came, and another. Until the cabin behind the tree became something else entirely, a home for those discarded, a map for the forgotten. Noor passed in the winter, with Grace holding her hand and Ezra reading aloud the same line Caleb once carved, "For every tree I've cut, let this be the one that grows." They buried her beneath the roots. No stone, just petals, falling like memories that finally knew peace. And above her, carved deep into bark, was a new line. She turned silence into shelter. And in that village, once cruel, once blind, no girl was ever sold again, only planted and grown